afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for being here today. My name is Dave Reist. I'm a senior research fellow here at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, and on behalf of Mr. Mike Swetnam, our CEO, and General Al Gray, 29th Commandant of the Marine Corps, and Chairman of the Board of Regents, it's a pleasure to have you here today. I see some regular faces, so I won't belabor the point of what the Potomac Institute is all about. Today's title is the Emerging New Middle East and State-Sponsored Terrorism, a Dilemma for Policymakers. You know, as I thought about that, as the saying goes, the only thing that remains the same is everything changes in this world. And when you look at that, you got to say, okay, the new Middle East, I guess one has to assume that there was an old Middle East, and we had policies that impacted against that old Middle East as well as the emerging new Middle East. And what do those pressing policies need to address relative to our national security and our policy as a nation writ large? As always, Dr. Yonah Alexander has put together a very, very gifted panel. You didn't come here to listen to me speak. You came to listen to them. So at this point in time, I will turn it over to Dr. Alexander and put the remainder of the program in his very capable hands. Dr. Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for your opening remarks. Can you hear me in the back? Wonderful. Just one word about General David Risk. It needs no introduction, I think. We're delighted to have him as a distinguished colleague right here with his rich background, command assignments and the staff assignments, etc., as well as the academic. I must mention that because I'm proud that he graduated from the State University of New York. In addition to the Marine Corps War College and the Naval War College, he has a few masters. What is really important that David is really focusing on one of the major challenges of our time, the cyber threat. We had a little experience this week when there was a power blackout and we had to swim, in the dark. We couldn't use the computers and so forth. But as we say, the worst is yet to come, and we worry about the future in this area, and obviously the whole issue of the Middle East and the state-sponsored terrorism. Now, first, I would like to welcome our very distinguished panel right here. The first is Margaret Nardi, who is the Director of Regional Affairs of the Office of Coordinator for Counterterrorism and the U.S. Department of State. I'm going to introduce each speaker a little bit later on, more detail. Next to her is Lieutenant General retired Keith Stelder, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Potomac, and welcome to join us. We are grateful for your participation. Next to him is Colonel retired Terry Taylor, who currently is the President of the International Council for Life Sciences, formerly with the IISS and in London, and he was the President, Executive Director of the U.S. And finally, Steve Larby, Dr. Steve Larby, is a distinguished chair in the European Security at the RAND Corporation. I'm going to introduce them a little bit later on. I'd like to make some comments. Before that, Obviously, as always, I'm grateful to our colleagues at the Potomac for their participation, Ambassador Dave Smith here, and Dr. Hamid and Mrs. Hamid. And we do have some of our colleagues that go back all the way, contributed. Dr. Milton Honig is a nuclear physicist and participates in our work. And I know Ambassador Ed Marks is going to be here momentarily. And from the State Department, we have other people, and Richard Croson right here, who is sitting, wanted him up front, who participated and contributed a great deal to our academic work on the NATO issues and so on. And I see in the back the Vice President Gail Clifford, who provides all this wonderful cooking for us to keep us alive. Now, as the General said, I mean, we came to listen to our speakers, but did you find any academic who would resist making a few footnotes? And they're going to be short, but I really wanted to mention basically some sort of a context for our discussion. First of all, in terms of the academic perspective, why should we bother? We know from our experience that a university or think tank is not a place but a concept, which really means that we cannot do all the work in isolation, and we have to cooperate with academic institutions throughout the world. And the work is truly interdisciplinary. Again, from the academic point of view, we must deal with unclassified information. We have two missions. One is to learn from the lessons of history, the best experience in terms of the nature of the threat and what worked in terms of the response, success and failure, and so on. And then we are looking at the so-called future. We're not prophets, but we try to anticipate trends and directions and so forth. So the kind of work that we're doing, we didn't start from scratch to discuss these issues on the Middle East and state-sponsored terrorism today and for decades. I'm mentioning this because there is some chronology in terms of the work that we're doing, not only with the academic, but with government, whether it's the State Department, the National Security Council, or Congress for many, many years. Not only the testimony, but also preparing some studies exactly related to the Middle East and state-sponsored terrorism. Beyond that, obviously we have opportunities to work with parliaments around the world through a structure, academic structure, which is called the Interparliamentary Council for Combating Terrorism, to encourage national legislation, international treaties, and so forth. And the last time we had a session with the Foreign Relations Committee in Morocco about a couple months ago, while there were many activities in the area. So again, this is the general academic perspective. Now, let me say one word, which I cannot resist, about the Middle East, and then on terrorism. Obviously, when we read the papers or we watch television, there are many views, concepts, and terms about what's going on in the Middle East. Uprising and rebellion and the Spring Revolution, etc., etc. I recall that the distinguished British historian H.A.P. Taylor, he observed that the first modern revolution was, of course, in the 18th century in France. And some of the causes that he tried to underscore for the revolution were democracy, nationalism, and socialism. And of course, we know what happened after that in the 19th century, in 1848, the focus was more on nationalism. And then, of course, the last major revolution, the last European revolution, took place in 1917 with communism regarding the nature of socialism. Now, what about the Middle East? The question really arises, and hopefully the panel might consider, are we talking about revolution without revolutionaries in terms of the leadership, or revolutionaries without a revolution? Do we witness really revolution in the Middle East? And clearly, nothing is new in the Middle East in terms of uprising or coup d'etat. You can mention so many countries, all the way from, obviously, Turkey going back to Kemal Atatürk, as well as Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, Libya, Gaddafi, then Syria, Assad, and Iraq, Saddam. Now, the current tsunami in the Middle East obviously raises many of the issues in terms of the outcome. One particular aspect, obviously, is the question related to the political, social, economic, and strategic perspectives. In other words, we would have to deal with some of these issues and implications. No definitive answer is expected today or in the coming weeks and months, since the only certainty we have in the Middle East is uncertainty about developments. Now, what about state-sponsored terrorism? Obviously, we have a very distinguished panel to discuss it. I'd like to recall, and again to mention to the attention of the audience, that terrorism is only one of the many challenges that is facing the international society, nature-made Japan, or the man-made, whether we're dealing with crime or piracy and so on. So state-sponsored terrorism is, again, one of the many challenges that we have, because we have to be concerned about the non-state, whether it's the Al-Qaeda or the foreign affinity terrorism in the United States, or perhaps the direction of the Muslim Brotherhood, and so on. We have to deal with conventional, we have to deal with unconventional, and so forth. So the confusion really arises, what does it mean, state-sponsored terrorism? Are we discussing low-intensity conflict? Are we discussing, for example, insurgency, guerrilla warfare, asymmetric warfare, and so on? And who are the actors? We know the traditional actors, Syria, for example, we know Iran, and the Sudan. Now, what about Libya? What about the next actors, such as Yemen and perhaps Lebanon? So these are some of the issues that I think we're going to discuss today in terms of the nature of the threat. And the question is, what about the future? One final historical footnote. We tried to look at the anniversary dates. And I would like to mention, obviously, one which really relates to Libya, the 15th anniversary on April 5th, 1986, when Libya triggered this attack in Berlin, this attack, as you know, and the question arises, is Libya trying to get back to its old game? And then the second historical, I think, anniversary is the 18th anniversary, the attempted assassination of President Bush in Kuwait by Iraq. Finally, again, we have to see the broader picture, not only what's happening in the Middle East, but clearly in this country, and as you know, we are marking now the 16th anniversary of the attack in Oklahoma City. Now, our first panelist is Margaret Nardi. As I mentioned, she's the Director of International Affairs, Office of Secretary Coordinator for Counterterrorism. She has a very rich background. We do have the bios of each panelist. I'm not going to go into details except to say that she has experience for many years throughout the world, including Somalia and Yemen and Afghanistan and Pakistan, North Africa and Latin America, and North Africa in particular, Algeria, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, and so forth. She's also served around the world, all the way from Ankara to El Salvador. So she will present some of her views through the work of the State Department. Maggie?
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Dr. Alexander, and thank you to the Potomac Institute for hosting this event on an issue that is certainly the focus of the State Department's attention these days. It's my pleasure to talk about the incredible changes that have been taking place in the Middle East, North Africa region. I don't think any of those of us who worked on the region here or inside the region ever saw such dramatic changes taking place even just a few months ago, and certainly never thought that the single act of a desperate street vendor in Tunisia was going to be the spark that resonated across the entire region. It's ironic for us, in fact, that it was Tunisia where this began. We had been talking to the governments in the region for some years about the pressure cooker that was building with the large and growing youth population, the high unemployment rate, lack of economic opportunities, disparity between rich and poor, lack of a broad civil society, and there really wasn't much of an outlet. And Tunisia, unique in the region, actually had taken some small step to try to address this in their own way by opening up educational opportunities for everyone in the country, or more than certainly than in Morocco or some of the neighboring countries. So what that ended up creating is an educated group that still couldn't find a job, and that now was better equipped to look around and see the disparity in wealth, to see the corruption in the government, and had nothing that they could do about it. I don't know that Mohammed Bouazizi, the young street vendor who self-immolated and set this whole spark off, actually was able to take advantage of any of these economic opportunities. But even if he had, I think the result would still be the same. So while it's unfortunate, his act has sparked something that I think was coming for some time. And the title of this session being a dilemma for policymakers, I think I would probably view it slightly differently. I think in the view of the State Department, the tremendous changes across the region are an incredible opportunity, very positive. Now, of course, it is early days yet. But as our Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Bill Burns, recently said to Congress, it's a moment of enormous promise for people and society's long denied freedom, dignity, and opportunity. We had constructive relationships with all these governments. We continue to have constructive relationships with some. We certainly worked closely with Egypt on the peace process, and we counted many of them, including Libya, close counterterrorism partners. That is a fact. However, that wasn't the sum total of the U.S. relationship with them. We had also initiated a human rights dialogue in Libya. We had publicly criticized the Tunisian elections in 2009 that brought Ben Ali to power for the 5th time with 90% of the vote as not being free, fair, or transparent. And we were working with NGOs across the region to try to teach them about ways to organize themselves, ways to cooperate with the government to try to work for peaceful change inside of the system in which they lived. When our efforts and the efforts of the government failed to achieve that, the people took matters into their own hands in a way that was very unexpected. And in fact, the way that this happened, in our view, completely repudiates the whole Al-Qaeda mantra that the only way there would be change in this region is through violent extremism, through violent jihad. These protests, particularly in Tunisia and in Egypt, they were peaceful demonstrations. Now, obviously, some violence broke out, but the protests themselves were peaceful. There was not a call to jihad. It was not done in the name of Islam. It was a call for the democratic freedoms that they've been lacking for so long. And I think one of the things that this points out is how out of touch groups like Al-Qaeda were, because I don't think they saw this coming any more than we did. They certainly didn't influence, they didn't lead it, and it shows to an extent that they were on the margins, that they were not in touch with the political realities going on in these societies. While these changes right now appear very positive, there's a clear recognition that they're also fraught with some risks, and that there is no guarantee of any particular outcome in any of these countries. The long-standing states of emergency, the lack of democratic freedoms, lack of economic opportunities will all be a challenge for these societies to come up with free, transparent, and democratic government systems to replace what was there. And as we saw in Tunisia and more recently in Cairo, the people who affected these changes have very specific ideas of what they expect to come and when. And if they don't see those changes, they go back to the streets. So it's not a process that has ended. It's ongoing, and it will continue to change. One of the challenges will be the differing histories and circumstances in each of these countries. So that will mean a cookie-cutter approach to resolving all the changes and establishing new governments will not be possible. But that said, across the board, there are some political, legislative, economic, and security changes that will need to be made. And the international community is now taking a hard look to see where we can be of assistance and how we can support this process. In Tunisia and Egypt, that work is already getting underway, and we're already seeing new opportunities in the area of human rights, democratic freedoms, and even counterterrorism, where we can be of some assistance. They're reaching out, which we see as a very positive sign. And because so many aspects of these governments have to change at the same time, it's actually an opportunity for the United States and other allies to step back and say, across the board, if you had the chance to go in and help somebody sort of develop a system, the human rights, the legislation, the judicial processes, law enforcement, everything, what would you do, rather than doing everything piecemeal, which is typically what has to be done. So we view that as a very positive opportunity. In the area of counterterrorism alone, there's a lot of work that can be done in ensuring signature to international treaties, strengthening counterterrorism financing efforts, strengthening border controls, which is a big concern, law enforcement's ability to identify, arrest, and investigate terrorism suspects, to try them in a transparent manner, and to improve the prisons, which have been the source for the spread of extremist messaging in a lot of these countries, where prisoners have not been segregated and they have been allowed to sort of send the message around. So the State Department's currently working with Justice and Treasury Departments, Department of Defense, FBI, DHS, and others to see how we can best help to affect these changes. That said, we recognize, however, that Al-Qaeda and others are not just sitting around idly while this process is ongoing. And there are a number of factors that sort of put these areas at risk. One of them is the fact that the security forces are now focusing on the internal unrest and not necessarily monitoring the borders to the extent they should be, and not focusing as much on counterterrorism as they had in the past. And there are extensive, porous, and unmanned borders across much of these countries, as well as ungoverned territories. And that will allow the transit of weapons, insurgents, and even more space for preparations to commit terrorist acts if we're not paying attention. Additionally, the Libyan regime had done a series of releases and amnesty of members of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group over the past several years who had formally renounced terrorism. Their main beef had been with Muammar Gaddafi, and they had renounced terrorism. However, given what's going on in Libya now with the rebel group fighting the Libyan regime, it's certainly possible that some of them are taking up arms to join that effort. In addition, there were prison releases and prison escapes in both Yemen and Egypt. A lot of those prisoners have not been accounted for. We know some have moved, so that is also a factor to be watched. And lastly, in Libya, the Libyan regime had opened up their armory to their supporters, and others had looted armory, so there are a lot of weapons that are not accounted for. And again, with the borders being so porous, there is certainly the possibility that they will move into the wrong hands. So those are things that we're watching very closely, no question. In the initial days of these protests, Al-Qaeda in particular seemed very quiet. I think maybe they were caught off guard as much as we were about the events that were happening. But starting in February, we started to see more public reports from Al-Qaeda leadership, as well as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, trying to capitalize on these events or even take credit for them, extolling the efforts of the rebels, calling for the establishment of Islamic governments, and most recently warning against the efforts of Westerners to get involved in the civil unrest. From what we see at this point, these statements don't appear to have resonated. In Egypt, the protesters took pains to note that the protesters were a mix of religions and a mix of political movements. There wasn't any particular group that dominated. And certainly the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a cause of great angst for a lot of people initially, while it was a player, it was certainly not the catalyst, and it is not a dominant player. It is one of many actors that are going to affect the changes in that government. So I think we should take that into perspective. In Libya, where Gaddafi blamed the unrest on Al-Qaeda, there is no evidence to support that claim. And in fact, the Transitional National Council in Benghazi, which is the sort of civil representation of the rebel group, issued a statement on March 30th condemning terrorism, assuring their continued combat of terrorists and refuting any claim that they have ties to Al-Qaeda. As I noted with the LIFG, there's certainly the potential that individual Al-Qaeda members have joined the rebel groups, but any presence that we've seen so far is not notable. And we continue to work with them. Secretary of State Clinton, as well as the EU, have met with the leadership of the TNC, and we have State Department representatives now working with them, trying to help shape what comes after the conflict has ended. We also continue very strong counterterrorism partnership across the region. The new forming governments in Tunisia and Egypt have pledged to continue the close counterterrorism cooperation that we had. The same is true for Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, across the Gulf. There is no change in that, and we don't expect that to change, frankly. We talked a little about the current security concerns. I think the longer-term issue with respect to terrorism, state or otherwise, is if the situations in Libya and Yemen in particular, potentially Syria down the road, devolve into a stalemate between the government forces and the rebel groups that doesn't allow the formation of a legitimate government structure and supporting security apparatus after that. While Gaddafi traditionally fought the terrorists because they were after him, he has been known to use suitcase diplomacy to achieve whatever means he needs, so it's certainly possible that he would try to co-opt them, and as I mentioned, there is the potential that they could join the rebel group. So that's certainly out there. The U.S. intelligence community has characterized Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula as the single biggest terrorist threat to the United States, in part because of the Nigerian student who attempted to blow up a U.S. airliner in December of 2009, and then the failed attempt last October to send 2 package bombs to the U.S. from Yemen. Both of those were thwarted, but they've made very clear their intent to reach the U.S. homeland, so that's obviously a main concern. We continue our counterterrorism cooperation with President Saleh and that government. Obviously, as I said earlier, though, they're a little distracted at the moment, so we have to be very vigilant about that. Our expectation, however, is that no matter what happens in Yemen, and we're watching AQAP closely and don't see that they have a role at all in the protests so far, and they're just potentially watching how they could use the space, but we don't think that whatever happens in Yemen, that our counterterrorism cooperation will end. I think it's changing, certainly for the time being. If the revolts result in democratically elected, non-autocratic governments, Al-Qaeda's single-minded focus on terrorism as an instrument of political change could be severely delegitimized, which is our goal and our hope. And we view this as a moment of great possibility, but as we noted, with caution. No matter the outcomes, however, we do remain confident that our counterterrorism partnerships in the region with whatever form of government comes out will not end. They may have to evolve, they will have to adjust, The only thing that's certain is change, as has been said, but we are confident at this point that the changes are positive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Obviously, you know, every day there is something new. Zawahiri just came out with a broadcast, again trying to capitalize on the situation in Libya and elsewhere. Our next speaker is Lieutenant General Keith Stelder. Retired, as I mentioned before. We are very fortunate that the General joined the Potomac Institute as a senior fellow. Obviously, it needs no introduction after decades of distinguished service to the nation. The Joint Marine Corps operational assignments and is work throughout the world, and I know I cannot go into great details, but I know that we certainly are aware of his many extraordinary contribution to national security, global security concerns, all the way from commanding general of the U.S. Marine Corps Pacific, the forces in the Pacific, in Hawaii, Camp Lejeune, and elsewhere. So he basically is one of the military most experienced operational planners and commanders with this experience in the United States and abroad. And I would like to also mention that he graduated, he has masters in aeronautics and the Marine Corps Command and Staff College and the Armed Forces Staff College and the NATO Defense College in Rome, Italy. General, please.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, Dr. Alexander. It's an honor to be here, and very much appreciate the opportunity to participate, and always extremely educational to hear the views of so many talented and knowledgeable people. And I will start by saying that many of the points that Maggie just made are some that I have thought my way through, and I'll try not to duplicate too many of those as I go through my notes. But the context of the current unrest in the region is absolutely striking, as I think everybody will agree. And in understanding terrorism and state-sponsored terrorism, I think the context of what's unfolding there now will define it for perhaps decades to come. The popular upheavals that are underway or are underway in almost every Arab nation. We would not have predicted, as Maggie said, a civil war in Libya. A decades-old government in Egypt has been replaced. The same is likely to be true in Yemen. Saudi Arabia has sent troops into Bahrain. Would have been unimaginable 6 months ago, perhaps. The U.S.-Saudi relationship is at an all-time low, in my opinion, owing to our lack of support for Hosni Mubarak and our lack of empathy for their concerns about Iran and the treatment of the Shias in Bahrain. The U.S. withdrawal from Iraq is underway and may change or may not change here in the near future. And of course, U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is planned, and we don't yet know what form or what speed that will occur. I dare say the U.S. relationship with Pakistan is difficult for many reasons. Egypt's transition to its next government is certainly uncertain, at least to me. And all of the states in the region are vulnerable to more and deeper opposition from their own citizens, and they clearly recognize that, I believe. So change is occurring, more is coming. I think some of it will be more violent and some of it will be more peaceful. It's difficult to predict that. I hope that it will be more secular than otherwise. I think that's a critical issue that should be watched in the context of understanding possible state-sponsored terrorism effects. But every Arab leader who is not already deposed or under pressure is asking himself, what will happen if I have this level of problem in my own country in terms of U.S. action? And that is a key question in the region. All of this, I think, will eventually give rise to more state-sponsored terrorism. It's difficult to say how much, and I'll welcome questions and discussions on it. But the equilibrium in the region, such as it has been, is clearly becoming less balanced than it was. I think for the time being, I would say the next 2 to 3 years, the traditional and the potential exporters of state-sponsored terrorism will find themselves preoccupied with regime survival. Maybe not totally, but certainly when you wake up every morning as an autocratic Arab leader, your first thought is probably, how do I keep my job and how do I maintain the status quo? Hopefully, the transitions that are underway will be more or less democratic and secular, or relatively peaceful transitions even to autocratic rule could occur as well. But from this, I think a pattern may emerge, and it starts with popular unrest, followed by vigorous efforts on the part of the regime to maintain the status quo and retain their position as incumbents. From there, if that is not developing as they would like, potentially outright civil war as we see in Libya, or a peaceful transition to some sort of a new leadership. Perhaps in Egypt we will see that, and certainly we hope so. Or potentially a muddled combination may emerge as well. There's no tradition of democracy in the Arab world, as we know. There's not a culture of experience with it. And from those scenarios, particularly the more muddled scenarios or the civil war scenarios, I think that what we will see over time is a series of insurgencies within those nations. And these will have various levels of intensities and various levels of endurance. But I predict that the numbers of those will increase as this upheaval is resolved. I see state-sponsored terror supporting those insurgencies in as much as they support a state-to-state objective that may be involved. An example I would offer is not unlike Iraq, in which we saw an Iranian intervention in Iraq, and certainly I saw that up close and personal, and that is potentially a model for the future as these things develop. But in the near term, regime survival and status quo will be the dominant issue, I think, in the region. A possible variation of this scenario is one that concerns me. And as you know, while some Arab states are willing to covertly deal with Israel, they are not willing to incur the displeasure of their own populaces over open cooperation. It's not inconceivable to me that regimes under pressure might distract their publics from local matters by rallying them around an anti-Israeli cause, which clearly would be bad for the region, bad for Israel, and bad for the U.S. Present state-sponsored terrorism will continue, in my view. Those efforts, such as we see with Iran, in Iraq, Hezbollah, Syria with Hezbollah, and so on. But strategic predictions are difficult, and I thought that I owed the audience today some specific recommendations on things we might do, particularly from an operational military perspective. I think that starts with an understanding of what U.S. vital interests are. And I say vital interests in the sense of sustaining our way of life, not in something that's mildly interesting, but something that's truly essential to U.S. interest. And this may not be exactly correct, but the ones that I think of are oil and energy, of course, strategic access and presence in the region, ensuring that WMD does not fall into the hands of terrorists, the elimination of safe havens, and the containment of Iran. So I would offer some recommendations. Maintain, as needed, a presence in Iraq. Iraq must not be allowed to slide back into anarchy. It's a nascent democratic experiment, and I hope that it will succeed. Thoughtfully and strategically draw down in Afghanistan and in a way that enables them to sustain the progress that they've made. Excuse me. Continue and deepen our cooperation with friendly nations to ensure that WMD does not fall into the hands of terror groups. Maintain and, if possible, increase U.S. military forward presence in the region, including land-based prepositioning. Capitalize on U.S. experience in counterinsurgency and counter-terror with friendly nations in the region. We have the most experienced and capable military in the world at counterinsurgency operations. Increase intelligence sharing. Increase the IMET program. Focus our attention on repairing our relationship with Saudi Arabia and helping them avoid the kind of unrest that is arising in the rest of the region. Be willing and able to preemptively eliminate terror safe havens wherever they may be in the region. Create a regional program of cooperation with friendly nations to combat terror. Call it Cooperative Defense Initiative with multiple functionalities: banking, law enforcement, military operations, cyber, border security and enforcement, counter WMD, and intel sharing, to mention some. Allow partner nations to select from this menu in a mutually reinforcing cooperation aimed at insurgency and counter-terror, especially state-sponsored counter-terror. Ensure that we're ready to meet our alliance and contingency obligations in the region with people, equipment, supplies, and the right training. Return to a continuous amphibious ready group Marine Expeditionary Unit presence in the Mediterranean. When we're able, return to a CV battle group presence in the Mediterranean. Promote regional multilateralism in military engagements. Bring back the Bright Star exercises. And then finally, frankly, discuss and study the capabilities of Iran with our regional partners. Thank you.
thank you very much, General, for your insights and particularly to remind us of some of the best practices that are so critical, and we're really grateful to you for that. Our next speaker is Colonel retired Terry Taylor. I have a personal, I think, pleasure to introduce him because Terry contributed to our study for a number of years through his work with the IISS, dealing with the British perspective on counterterrorism strategy, what worked, what doesn't work. And throughout the years, he has been a great supporter and providing a great deal of guidance. Terry obviously participated in many activities in this country, in the UK, and abroad. I just want to mention one or two. Currently is the president of the International Council for the Life Sciences. Fundamentally, this organization designs to promote the best practices and the codes of conduct for the safety and security in relation to the biological risk. But Terry also worked on the weapons of mass destruction, on the nuclear issue. For example, he was the vice president dealing with the security and the nuclear threat initiative. In London, he was the assistant director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and he was the president of the IISS in the US. He was involved in many activities, the UK government, as an official, both military and diplomatic. He worked at the UN, and I'd like to mention also his contribution as one of the chief inspectors with the UN Special Commission in Iraq. So we're delighted to have him formally to speak on his perspectives of the state-sponsored terrorism.
Yeah, no, thank you for that generous introduction. Rather lengthy, perhaps a reflection of my advanced years. But thanks very much for inviting me to speak. My connection with the Middle East goes back in a number of different guises, but with the events going on now, it reminds me of my first one, which was, just think of the year 1969, and as a young military officer being inserted with a small group into Libya. And so you can perhaps reflect why that might have been the case, and why I probably won't say much about that particular period. But it makes me think about it quite. And in different ways, I've been there mainly as a military officer, but also more recently over Iraq and the UN Special Commission. And now one of my major projects is in connecting civic institutions and governments on health security, completely different. I never thought as a military officer I'd end up doing that, but I'm deeply involved in the Middle East more widely, and in particular with a very exciting Israeli-Palestinian Jordanian group which works together on health issues, which is really interesting. And of course you learn a lot about what's happening in the region when you're doing that. So a little bit of history, and I've no relation to A.J.P. Taylor, by the way, so not part of my family, but it made me think, because I heard President Obama 10 days ago after his meeting, I think with Shimon Peres, come out and make a statement. And he began with the words, "The winds of change are blowing through the Middle East." That's exactly what he said. And that made me go back into history to remember one of the first government leaders to use that phrase was Harold Macmillan, the UK Prime Minister, making a speech in South Africa to the South African Parliament. And he opened his talk, or speech rather, with the phrase, "The winds of change are blowing through Africa because of the decolonization." And you here in South Africa, remember he's talking to an apartheid regime, winds of change are going to affect you too. But it took 30 years, but nevertheless, I thought that reminded me of that. But the second phrase for which Harold Macmillan is famous is applicable now. Well, both are applicable, but the second one I think is particularly applicable. He was not noted as a strategic visionary, although the notes on that speech that I mentioned were sold at Christie's through auction just recently. I saw it on the internet, and for quite a tidy sum actually. But it showed that his hand was in it, and it was quite a shock to his own government that he actually said everything that he said, because they saw him as a pragmatic leader and so on. But a historian who was writing his biography interviewed him, and in the interview he said, with your strategic vision and so on, what was it that drove your policy development and so on? And he sat back in his chair, the interviewer said, and he said, events, dear boy, events. And that's what made the policy. And I think we're faced with that in the Middle East. I think that's just one of the realities. And I feel nervous following the distinguished speakers who've already spoken, because can I add value to what's already been said? I think that's a bit of a challenge. So I just offer some thoughts, perhaps, that will lead us to help to think about these developments, and also perhaps to provoke a few themes that might lead to help us in our discussion. Well, what do we mean, going to our title, The New Middle East and State-Sponsored Terrorism? Well, I think what is the Middle East might be something that we need to think about. And I would think about this issue from Morocco in the west through to Pakistan in the east. And there's no other way to think about it, and maybe even Turkey, if you're going north a little bit, and down to Sudan and Somalia in the further south. And so when you're trying to think of all the implications, possibilities of terrorist havens and so on, that's the way to think about it. But so I think it's really important to do that. And perhaps I could offer two axes. One is thinking of it through the lens of, I hesitate to use the expression now, Middle East peace process, but you know what I mean, the Palestinian-Israeli issue and all the issues associated with that. That tends you towards a top-down process. And you could argue that looking at it through a top-down lens, because that's the way we've been looking at the Middle East, that's been the centrality of policy action in that region for decades, with particular players. I remember myself being in the ACRS process, the Arms Control and Regional Security Working Group of the Middle East process at that stage, and all the high hopes that were entertained before that dreadful assassination in 1993, when everything changed again there. But so should we look at it as a top-down process? I think perhaps not, although you have to keep in mind that I believe the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or relationship, how that developed, remains a central issue and does affect the issues of terrorism and so on. So you have to keep that issue there, and I think we have to think about it in a different way. And another axis that because bearing in mind the title, I might have found another axis having had the title, state-sponsored terrorism. I think the one country now, the major actor in state-sponsored terrorism, is undoubtedly Iran. That's already been mentioned. And that gives you an axis, in a geographical sense, across the Gulf, what's happening in Bahrain maybe, into Lebanon with Hezbollah, and then of course into the Palestinian territories and support for Hamas and so on. So there's another way of looking at it. But I think really we need to think about it more of a bottom-up process. Another word in our title for this session is dilemma. Well, let's talk of the horns of a dilemma, that's just two, but unfortunately there are probably about 22 horns we have to think about, and I don't envy the State Department in its role at the moment, is to try to think of a thread that connects everything, to have a strategic concept which brings everything together. I don't think you can do that right now, and I wish that was possible. But I think just keeping in mind those axes I mentioned might help as a way to think our way through all these issues. So I'm now just going to touch on a number of countries. I'm not going to mention countries like Morocco and Jordan, although they are important. They are facing challenges, so you can't exclude them from consideration. So to try to have this connecting perspective is a real challenge. And if you do try to connect too much, you see phrases like Arab uprising, for example, and is it the communications and the connectivity that people have that, is this the connecting thread? In Yemen, 1.6% of the population have access to the internet. Let me just throw that out for a moment before we get carried away with Twitter and Facebook and so on. So you have to take a more fine-grained approach to this. And I suppose you have to think about each country in turn, or each key country, but keep in mind those axes I mentioned, and that might help to connect. So each country undergoing change has unique characteristics. And just as I said, I'll make a few remarks. Some of these have been made, so I can keep them short. We've heard about Tunisia, and there was a strong professional class looking west, a secular movement. The economic factors were the dominant ones, the lack of freedom and the corruption. I think we've already heard that. But perhaps not quite the same in Egypt, where the military played a really very important role. So that's something that was not there in Tunisia. Deliberately, Ben Ali did not make the military strong. It wasn't although he had his strong paramilitary forces and police forces, but it was different in Egypt. And so the role of the army has been not just the paramilitary, but the army proper has been vital in the way they played their hand, in the way that the bottom-up revolution, we might put it that way, or evolution, we might say. We have the parliamentary elections coming up in September and a presidential election in December, if everything goes according to plan. Amir Musa as a possible, probably the leading candidate, former Secretary General of the Arab League. But there are various challenges in predicting this outcome. Will the peace treaty continue to be serve in the same way to the Middle East peace process or the Israeli-Palestinian confrontation in the same way as it has in the past? Probably not, depending on who takes over. If it's Amir Musa, one could probably be more calm about that, and that may be the case because he was certainly wedded to it. But will the population in Egypt allow that kind of approach to continue? So I think there's a number of uncertainties there, and one needs to think about the army. A week ago today, in the demonstration to Tahrir Square, which became rather violent, there were 50 military officers amongst the crowd. And that was the reason why the police and military intervened in a way they did. So that's a concern. I don't have enough insight to know how large that is, but if there are 50 officers in that demonstration, tip of the iceberg, there are larger dissatisfied people if progress doesn't take place quickly enough, the right people are not called to account, and so on. All these things are the uncertainties in the case of Egypt, which again is a different process to what's happening in Tunisia. Just a few words on Syria. We've already heard a little about them. The Alawite minority ruling regime is obviously under threat. It's trying to make concessions in order to keep key allies, most recently to the Kurdish population in Syria. So they're in regime survival mode, as the general already said, so they're focusing on that. So I think the concentration on maintaining domestic stability for the regime is likely to reduce the propensity for support for outside activities. We've heard a little bit about Yemen. If President Saleh does go, but I think Margaret might be more expert than I on this subject, although I've been to Yemen, but I can't claim to have the kind of insight or access to information. Is the new regime going to be as sympathetic to carrying out or cooperating, shall I say, on counter-terrorism policies? I just put that as a question. I'm not so certain or so confident about that, but I think that's something that we could discuss, whether it's state or non-state sponsored. We already know that Yemen has become one of the havens, a home for Al-Qaeda-like affiliates. They have their own domestic problems, obviously the Shia in the north, the South Yemen, as well as the international terrorist groups that are operating there. So Western counter-terrorism policies are widely unpopular, I would say, from my reading and understanding and talking to Yemenis that are there, is unpopular. That doesn't mean we can't do it. It may mean, as Margaret said, we have to do these things differently. We have to think about them differently. So, moving on from Yemen, I hate giving countries. It's very like 2 or 3 sentences. It doesn't make me feel comfortable when you're talking about very intricate relationships within a country, cultural, religious, family relations, and so on. So I apologize for giving them very short shrift, but I think we're compelled to do that for the moment, just to think about things. And I suppose I had next to my list, I think it's too speculative to say anything too certain about Libya. As has already been said, it's now reduced. It began as a people's revolution, you could say, at least in the eastern part of the country, but it's now an armed conflict, straightforward armed conflict, and actually an international armed conflict. Obviously, other armed forces are taking part, so it's not a civil war. It's not the way to think about it in a legal sense, because there are other actors at play. So we have to think about it in legal terms as an international armed conflict, I would say. Now, is there a risk that supposing there is just a possibility, I personally think it's unlikely, but it's just a possibility that Gaddafi may remain in control, perhaps even just a part of the territory of what is now Libya. That probably will lead to some risk in the increase of state-sponsored terrorism, if you would call what would remain with Gaddafi a state, but I think there is a risk there. So we don't know how that's going to turn out, but we have to keep our eye on that one. And just finally, in terms of going around countries, on Iran, I mean, there's no change, I would say, in the leadership likely in the short term. So we have this theocratic but pragmatic, in a way, leadership. It will continue, obviously, in support of Hezbollah and Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza. You could argue they have more influence now in Lebanon because with the demise of Hariri and the new prime minister, which has the support of Hezbollah. But having just recently been there and just observed events, you have to remember that Lebanon was one of the co-sponsors of the UN Security Council resolution for the no-fly zone over Libya. So I think that's an interesting take as to where they are and how they feel domestically. In my visit to Beirut just 2 or 3 months ago, there was an intense focus on internal issues of making Lebanon work, whichever part of the Lebanese elements that you are, it's like a kaleidoscope, whichever part you're thinking about. And so there was very much an internal focus and very much having Lebanese control over what is happening in the Lebanon. That was a very strong impression that came through to me talking to various people, some in government and some outside. So that's, I'm still talking about Iran really and their influence. So they have potential influence in the Lebanon, they have a lot of interest, they remain connected to Hezbollah, but I think one has to temper it with looking at events as they're happening. But what about across the Gulf, in Bahrain, and other Gulf states and the relationship to Iran and them? Well, I would say they have enormous investments for a start. I think there's an economic constraint over disrupting regimes in the Gulf as far as they're concerned, if we just put it rather crudely. Enormous investments in places like Dubai and so on. So I would say that they would not want to see major disruptions in the Gulf. Of course, Saudi Arabia is nervous. undoubtedly they're alarmed by the way the US, I'm not challenging the policy, I think it's the right policy, stepped away from supporting Mubarak. It's the right thing to do, but that made the Saudi regime nervous, and obviously there's some repairing of relations, which I'm sure is going on. And so in terms of the dynamics across the Gulf, I don't know that it has an impact on state-sponsored terrorism, our subject here, but I do think it makes those countries think about their own security, perhaps in a way they hadn't been thinking too much before, that they need their own sub-regional or regional dynamics to look after themselves. I think that there's a driver there that may drive them along, but I don't think it's going to lead to greater state-sponsored terrorism, or if anything, it might make it less. So my conclusion then is the risk of state-sponsored terrorism increasing as a result of all these events. My tentative conclusion is probably not, for the reasons that we've just described. Are there more opportunities for the non-state, if you would call them that, terrorists like Al-Qaeda? There definitely, as has already been said, Al-Qaeda very much on the back foot because of the events, and these events are not being led in the name of religion. They are very much strong secular elements to do with control of their own lives, the economy and corruption and all these other things. And so I think Al-Qaeda have not really managed to respond to this present situation. However, we shouldn't make ourselves too comfortable. As I think someone, I think it was Yona at the beginning, spoke about the French Revolution, 1917, which began as democratic processes, but the opportunists managed to seize control of these things and convert them into very nasty regimes and great losses of life. So I don't think we can be too comfortable. The likelihood of that happening, given the nature of communications and so on, this is where I think communications will play a role in the way they didn't. So we have to be careful about the lessons from history that long ago. So I think that the likelihood of these revolutions being taken over, the only country that would worry me most would be the Yemen in that particular context, but I feel more confident about the other countries. And so I think we have to look at the MENA region, the Middle East, North Africa region, like a collection of biological organisms. They're interacting with each other. They're going through a reassortment of genes like viruses do when they interact with one another. If you think about influenza viruses, they're constantly reassorting, changing, because the action in one affects the other. So we have to think about the region like that. I'm afraid it doesn't help the policymakers very much. But I think that's an interesting way to think about it. And so I think that's all of my remarks. You could read a book called Natural Security, which I hate doing book promotions, but I was a co-editor, where we're thinking about biology and its impact on security policy making. So leave that little commercial at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry, and in fact his excellent, if I may say so, book on natural security was published by the University of California Press, and I certainly would recommend it. Now, obviously, each speaker triggers a great deal of questions and ideas, and we can leave it to the Q&A in regard to your very, I think, deep and rich panoramic analysis of the region. I think sometimes the answers, some of the answers will develop very shortly, for example, in regard to the question of Gaza as a mini-state sponsor in September, when the General Assembly of the United Nations obviously will vote, as we expect, in favor of establishment of a Palestinian state. Then we'll see what happens. We'll come back to it now. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen Larrabee, who is a distinguished chair now of European security at the RAND, and as an academic, I recall from many years his many contributions as a scholar with the Institute of East-West Security Studies, for example, in the RAND, as well as his work at the National Security Council, staff in the White House, specializing on the Soviet East European affairs and East-West political and military relations. His many contributions, his writing and publications, all the areas related to the Middle East, on U.S.-Turkish relations, political Islam and Europe, and so on and so forth, the Balkans. And I'm very pleased to introduce him as a academic colleague. He taught at Columbia, Cornell, New York, John Hopkins, Georgetown, George Washington, and so on and so on. And I'm very also pleased that he's an alumni of Columbia University, where I guess we had to suffer until we got the PhD there. Stephen?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonah, for that introduction. I really think it wasn't me that had to suffer, but rather my professors. It's always difficult to be last in a panel. I've had that experience a number of times, rather recently on a panel in NATO, and right before the fourth speaker got up, I turned to him and said that I didn't think there was much more to be said that could be said. And he said to me, yes, but not everyone has said it. So with that, let me begin. I'd like to try to put recent developments in the Middle East in a broader context, because what we're witnessing, obviously, is a very important process of change. It is as important as transformation in my mind as what happened in Eastern Europe with the fall of communism in 1989 and 90, and perhaps even more important in some ways. And there have been a lot of efforts to compare in some way what happened in Eastern Europe with what's happening now in the Middle East. And I think that there are, in fact, more, this effort to kind of make that comparison obscures more than it reveals. There are important differences between what happened in Eastern Europe and what is happening in the Middle East, it seems to me. East European countries, depending on which ones, but nonetheless certainly in Central Europe, had some democratic traditions and institutions on which to build. Weak as they were, they still were there. With the exception of Egypt, I would say in the Middle East, this is largely not the case. So you have a institutional and vacuum of traditions that is much more acute than what was in Eastern Europe. And this means, in a way, that the process of change is likely to be slower and at the same time also more chaotic. And that the prospects of failure and the discontinuities and rupture are likely to be much greater. And these type of instabilities and chaotic developments could provide opportunities for terrorist groups to come to power. Another important factor is the diversity of the regimes themselves. It's hard, I think, to have an overarching policy towards the Middle East. One needs to treat each country, I think, much more on its own merits. And this also raises a problem of selectivity. It's hard to pursue similar policies throughout the regime throughout the region. And in some cases, it looks oftentimes as if there are contradictions. Why is the United States or the West supporting democratic change in some countries, particularly Egypt, while being rather cautious about that in other countries such as Bahrain? This is not a criticism of policy. I'm just simply saying that it's very difficult to have a uniform and unified policy. One of the things that I think is important is, in fact, the role of the military in many of these countries. The weakness of democratic traditions and institutions means that in a number of countries, the military is likely to play an important role in the transitions. And this is particularly true, I would say, in Egypt and Tunisia. The military didn't play an important role in Eastern Europe, with the exception of Romania. And it's interesting in some ways to look at what happened in Romania and what happened in Tunisia. Now, there are important differences, particularly the fact that Tunisia has a highly educated, well-developed middle class, which Romania didn't have at all. But there are some important similarities. Both regimes were extremely repressive and had a regime which had very little support in the population. The degree to which the repression was carried out meant that, in fact, there was very little dissent. Civil society was extremely weak, almost non-existent, atomized. Corruption in both cases was extremely widespread. But the narrowness of the base of the regime, both Ben Ali's regime and Ceausescu's regime, there are quite similarities. And in the case of Ben Ali, I think one of the things that is contributed to his downfall was that you had most of the power and the wealth concentrated in a very, very small group of people. Extended family, people that were close to Ben Ali. And that's a difference, for instance, than in Egypt, where, in fact, the corruption was more widespread, but it also meant that more people had a vested stake in preserving the regime. Ben Ali, when he went, there was very little support, and not only from the wide population, but the regime did not have an extended group of support. And that was the same with Ceausescu. And the final thing is the military. In both cases, the military the repression was done by in the case of Romania, the Securitate, the secret police, and in the case of Ben Ali, the kind of palace guard that he built up. So that when the regime collapsed, at that point, the military could emerge as a factor in the struggle for power afterwards, because they hadn't been associated in the eyes of the population with the repression. The repression was carried out by, as I said, the Securitate in the case of Romania, and the kind of palace police on the part of Ben Ali. So this gave the military a possibility to act as a kind of intermediary. And in the case of Tunisia, it was the fact that the chief of the general staff was not willing to shoot and to take action against the dissenters that led to Ben Ali deciding to flee. So it's interesting to look at the role that the military can play in both those cases. As far as Egypt goes, it seems to me that you have a possibility of 4 different scenarios that could take place. The first is a reconstitution of the ancien regime with some token reforms. That is to say that basically what happens, that some effort to open up the system takes place, but what you have is the same. You have Mubarakism without Mubarak, essentially. Now that's one possibility. The military doesn't rule directly, but the whole web of institutional interactions remains relatively the same. A second possibility, which is often talked about, is where the military, might call it the Turkish model, where the military retires or returns to the barracks, but rules indirectly behind the scenes, that before it goes, it works out a kind of agreement that preserves its important role and therefore doesn't have to rule directly, but rules indirectly. And that was basically what happened in most of the time in Turkey. Yes, the military intervened, they rewrote the constitution, they arrested some people, but eventually they didn't want to rule directly, and within 2 or 3 years they went back to the barracks. But they always tried to make sure that their own prerogatives were secured, and they made sure that they were the umpire behind the scenes, that if there was a threat to their power, they would intervene. A third possibility, it seems to me, is one which you've seen in Latin America at times, and also, let's say, in Spain, a pact in which the ancien regime turns political power over to the new democratic forces in exchange, essentially, for retaining their economic privileges. So you do have a real change politically, but economically, the ancien regime maintains their privilege. The last one possibility, it seems to me, is that chaos in the transition fails. Chaos and instability lead to the emergence of a radical, extremist, and possibly Islamist regime. Now, if you ask me, I think the first 2 are more likely, and the fourth the least likely. Not excluding it entirely, but in Egypt's case, I think less than likely. More likely is a reconstitution of the ancien regime with some token reforms. One has to realize that the Egyptian military is first a state within a state, and it also has very, very strong economic interests that are extended very wide in the society. There are reasons for this, because they want to have their own control of their industries, in large part because if there's some sort of a crisis, they don't want to be dependent upon outside forces. They want to be able to mobilize quickly, and so forth. And if you think about reform, one of the hard things that's going to be, one of the difficult challenges will be trying to introduce reforms into that type of a system, because if you want to have private enterprise, of course they have it now, but if you want to really have a pluralistic economic system, you are likely to find that the military is going to resist that, because that would mean, in many cases, that they have to give up many of the control of certain industries which they now have. Let me say a word about Libya. Here I think the basic problem, and let me say first, that this is another example of how difficult it is to have an overarching policy, because here the internal nature of the regime, you're talking about essentially a tribal society where in fact there is very little, obviously, democratic tradition or institutions at all. But the primary problem, I think, right now is that there is, from a policy point of view, is that there's a disconnect between the espoused political goals, both of the United States and of the leading European powers, which is to get rid of Gaddafi, and the military means allowed by the UN Resolution 1973. That is to say, you have a broad goal of regime change. Gaddafi's got to go, they all say. And yet the mandate does not allow the West to really support the rebels. It doesn't allow, there is an arms embargo and so forth. The idea that the West could, as Sarkozy wants, take aggressive action is prohibited essentially by the UN mandate. Now, some of the powers have tried to interpret that mandate rather broadly, but it is fairly clear that the intent of that is for humanitarian purposes, to prevent a humanitarian disaster, and it does not call for and allow one side to intervene on the side of the other. And the fact is that the rebels are too weak, too ill-equipped, too divided, in my view, to overthrow Gaddafi without, in fact, a large-scale intervention on the part of the West. Not saying boots on the ground, but certainly much more than what we're doing now. So therefore you do have a danger of a stalemate. A division of Libya into two different parts, one in the West, maybe with Gaddafi still in power, most likely, and one in the East. Perhaps even the West will be forced to have a no-fly zone over the eastern part. But if that continues, if you have this type of stalemate, which I think is likely, then I think you're going to find very quickly that there is an erosion of support for the intervention at all, and that it's going to be a very messy, drawn-out process, and in which, with Gaddafi surviving, and that itself, I think, will send a very strong message throughout the region, and there will be large-scale questioning of the West's determination and willingness to support the rebels. So I think we're heading for a very difficult position there. The alternative, which is to go beyond the resolution, has its pitfalls as well, because it is likely to lose the support of the Arab League and some of the NATO members themselves, particularly Germany and Turkey and some others, but those two mainly, are unlikely to support such aggressive action. So that in itself brings on problems. Let me say a word about Turkey, because I think Turkey, the shift in Turkish policy under the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, over the last 8 years or so, has been quite remarkable, and that Turkey is now emerging as a very important regional player in the Middle East. This is a situation or a development which is contrary to Turkish policy, and certainly in the post-war period, except for the 50s, in the mid-50s when you had the Baghdad Pact. But the basic thrust of Turkish policy, particularly under the secularist regimes that preceded the AKP, has been not to get deeply involved in the Middle East and to turn most of their attention to the west. Turkey has been very active diplomatically in the last few months. In Egypt, think of Erdogan's essentially suggestion, put it that way, that Mubarak should step down. Did this, he was one of the first that came out to do this. He has also said, more obliquely, but nonetheless in the last week or so, to Gaddafi, that he should step down as well. And there have been efforts at mediation in Bahrain and in Syria. So you can, in fact, there's very little, wherever there's some turmoil, you find the Turkish, either Erdogan or Davutoglu, the foreign minister, showing up, trying to insert themselves into the process and intervene. Now, there's been a lot of talk, particularly the Arab Arab street, about the so-called Turkish model as a model for what might develop in the Middle East. I think that this is highly unlikely. If you look at the Turkish model, it is a product of special Turkish circumstances, in my view. The westernization efforts in Turkey didn't start in 1923 with the founding of the Republic by Ataturk. They go back to the middle of the 19th century in the Tazimat period, and even before that. And Turkey had always, for several hundred years, an effort to fuse a kind of westernization with Islam, which does not a history of which does not exist elsewhere in the Middle East. Ataturk's role was unique. Looking around the Middle East, I don't see many Ataturks, quite frankly. And one should remember that it took Turkey 50 years to get to where it is now with the AKP and so forth. And the real Turkish model, which is probably more relevant, is the model which we mentioned before in the Egyptian case. The question whether Turkish, the military intervenes directly, kind of straightens out the mess, goes back to the barracks, but kind of maintains its power behind the scenes. That Turkish model, yes, I think that could be possible in a number of instances. The model of the moderate AKP Islamic model, I think, is unlikely for the reasons I've mentioned. Let me just conclude with a few remarks about the United States. I think it has been or is noteworthy that so far in many of these yearning for democracy and the upheaval, that there has been very little anti-Israeli sentiment and anti-US sentiment expressed. Now it's starting in some places, but the real impetus for this and the strongest sentiment has been for human and political rights and a kind of freedom. And it's very unusual, but there has not been a lot of waving of the anti-US flag. But any government, it seems to me, that comes to power in Egypt and in some of the other places is likely to be, in my view, less supportive of the peace process, and I'm talking about Egypt here in particular, and less supportive of the nature of relations that were maintained with Israel. That's a fact of life. We're going to have to live with that. It doesn't mean that you'll have a radical anti-American or anti-Israeli regime, but it does mean that you're not going to be able to have a sort of more pluralistic democratic regime and have the same old policy and the peace with the peace process that Mubarak pursued, and which was in, quite frankly, the Western and U.S. interest, in my view. The U.S. and the Western countries will have to set priorities we will not be able to intervene everywhere. And we already have the problem in Libya, where I think it's striking the degree to which very prominent, middle-of-the-road Republicans and Democrats have come out against the involvement in Libya. I think particularly of Richard Haas, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, who served several administrations, mostly Republican, on the Middle East, and where Richard has been very adamant and made very strong case that, you know, we don't have a big dog in this fight, and that we have scarce resources, and we should be husbanding those for other challenges that we're likely to face, which will directly impact on, more directly on our interests, particularly Syria and Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, of course, as well. Now, I'm not trying to support his view. I'm just saying that someone like this, Brent Scowcroft, others, the kind of realist school, very skeptical about getting involved in Libya. So we'll have to distinguish between those challenges which are to our vital interests and those which are to our lesser interests. Lastly, let me say a word about state-sponsored terrorism. I agree with Terry. I don't think state-sponsored terrorism is likely to increase overall. But extremist groups are likely to try and could succeed in exploiting the instability to increase their power in a number of places. So therefore, you may not see an increase of state-sponsored terrorism, but you could see an increase of extremist groups coming to power or challenging the status quo in the Middle East. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for raising some new aspects and perspectives. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of the points you made. Before we turn it over to the audience to ask questions, I would like to ask the panel whether you would like to make a comment on some of the other presentations at this point. Okay, so let me turn to the audience, and we'll ask first, would you kindly identify yourself and your affiliation?
There's supposed to be some kind of topic. I'm supposed to talk into this. Ira Strauss, Committee on Eastern Europe and Russia and NATO and Democracy International.
Hold it away from your mouth a little bit.
What am I supposed to do?
Just hold it down a little bit.
A little further out.
There
okay,
you go.
that better?
Yes.
Yeah, Ira Strauss. I am an American, but I'm always taken aback by the American assumption that revolutions are good and change is good. Good and evil is one polarity, change stability is another. There's no intrinsic relation to the two. And clearly these changes are dramatic, they're unfinished, and whether they'll be for the good or evil, none of us know. People expressing confidence of it worry me. My main presumption is the evidence thus far is they are clearly against our interests. They have overthrown two of the most benign regimes in the region. They have not yet succeeded in overthrowing any of the malign ones, although Gaddafi is teetering. How the enthusiasm can be so great, I can only attribute to American revolutionary prejudice. And that pervades the entire society, this panel least of all. But there are some things that affect the panel discussion from that worry me. There is no criticism of the American government for doing too much to promote the revolutions. And I mean by that not just the last few months, but the entire democratization industry, that we've seen in some other panels in town, how they've taken credit for having sponsored the teaching of the method of toppling benign governments by a nonviolent revolution. the hollowing out of regimes, the encouragement by the American military to the Tunisian military to not suppress the street and instead to push Ben Ali out. The encouragement by America to the Egyptian military to do the same to Mubarak. Now the persecution of Mubarak, which is applauded in the Washington Post, no one seems to have a sense of decency. He may be driven to his death. I worry about these things, and I worry about their long-term consequences for us. There is no criticism of the American government for being on the wrong side pro-revolution. It only feels pressure to do more for the revolution.
I'm sorry for interrupting.
Okay. I think that's enough
your
to suggest. The question is, don't we need a broader perspective? And one thing specifically on terrorism, don't we need to think that a greater Islamist influence will mean more of a wink-wink attitude toward terrorists?
Okay. Anyone? Yes, sir. Please, Stephen.
I disagree fundamentally, I guess, because I think that, first of all, this panel, at least, and to a large extent, a lot of the political views, are conflicted by what's going on because, of course, Mubarak in particular and some of the other regimes, even some of the most, the worst of the regimes, did serve American interests. But the issue is, how long could that go on? And what you had here was a spontaneous general uprising, which reflected deep-seated feelings and sentiment against the regimes, which were, by any criteria, corrupt and repressive. Now, Mubarak in some ways was less, you can argue, and that he did many good things for, I would say, the peace process in the United States. But the fact is, if you ask those people in the square what they felt and so forth, you could see very much that they were opposed to the repression. The same in Tunisia. I mean, Tunisia has a very large middle class, educated and so forth. But if you ask any Tunisian what he felt about the nature of that regime, even though, in fact, economically, things were far better in Tunisia than they were in almost any place else in the Middle East, I think it's quite clear what the population, the majority of the population thought. I agree it's not easy. I was trying to point out the difference. The problem that one faces is that, a regime that's in Bahrain or even Saudi Arabia, overthrowing that and the instability that would result would have major consequences economically and politically that we couldn't possibly even pretend to predict, except to know that they were bad. But I think you have to understand that there's I don't want to say an inevitability about it, but given the forces and the repression that these three regimes represented, even if they acted in U.S. interests at times, those days are probably over. And one has to adjust and try to work with the flow. I think, personally, President Obama is right to try to get on the right side of history.
Ambassador Smith, would you want to comment? Please, so they can hear you.
Thank you, Professor Alexander. I'd just like to make a few observations and ask a general question of the panel and maybe anyone else who wants to say something. For those of you that I've not had the pleasure to meet, I'm Dave Smith. I'm here at Potomac Institute. Colonel Taylor took away one of my very favorite quotes from Harold Macmillan. But I must say, though, Colonel, I disagree with you a little bit. I've met the man several times when he was Chancellor at Oxford University and found him to be a quite incisive and deep thinker. So, He came to power as Prime Minister, of course, at a particular moment in British history when Britain was making a major historical transition from being the world superpower to another role, and I think that might have something to do with it. But I have another quote from you, from another young English girl, Alice of Wonderland, you may remember. Alice, soon after coming out of the circular room, after experimenting with becoming larger and becoming smaller, met the Cheshire Cat. The Cheshire Cat, of course, had a grin that persisted, and he sat in a tree. And she said, "Please, Cheshire Puss, tell me which way I should go." And the cat responded, "That all depends on where you want to get." And Alice said, "Oh, I don't mind, so long as I get somewhere." And the cat said, "Then it doesn't matter which direction you go." As I listen to the discussion here and I read what's been said, what's been written over the last few weeks, particularly this discussion about Libya, what are we doing there? Why are we there? Yes, we're there to protect the people. Yes, the UN mandate, and I'm going to give you another quote in a minute, the UN mandate says what it says and not what some people say it says. But we may, to protect, as a humanitarian matter, the Libyan people, may have to do more than that resolution implies. So that leads me to my second quote. When you're talking about the Middle East, you should always quote Ben Gurion. UN Shmuan. At a certain point, you have to decide what you're going to do. And it seems to me that's what's missing in this whole discussion. We're talking about, does America have a policy? It may. And we go from country to country. In Egypt, we should do this. In Yemen, we should do this. I quite agree with Steve. We need to get out ahead of this. You can't just say, we like Mubarak, we always liked Mubarak. Mubarak was on his way out, and you've got to figure out what to do. I mean, that's a reality, so you've got to keep that up. But what has to hold all of this together that seems to me is missing is, what is your objective? Policy, if you look at a pyramid, is below your national strategy, your grand strategy. What are you trying to do here? And it seems to me that is what is missing in contemporary American foreign policy. And I don't put that just to the Obama administration. I would put it equally to the Bush administration. We don't seem to know what the objective of the United States is. We jump right in the middle of the pyramid at the policy. What is our policy about Egypt? What is our policy about Yemen? What is our policy about Syria? What is our policy about Libya? We don't seem to know what it is our own interest is. And it seems to me that is fundamentally the problem. Yes, events get in the way, as Harold Macmillan said. You have to deal with the events. But it's always good if you know where you're trying to get. So my question to the panel is this. What is the objective? Or, if there's more than one, the objectives of the United States that impinge upon, and I've noticed I didn't say in the Middle East, that impinge upon, what are our global objectives that impinge upon our policy making for the Middle East? Thank you.
Terry or General? The General.
That's a big question, obviously. My experience, and it's not a broad experience. My experience is as a nation, we don't do very well at selecting our vital national interests. And there are other interests that are good, and they tend to become part and parcel of how it is we do business in a way that obscure the vital interests. I would suggest to you that a vital interest in the Mideast is oil. I would put that at the very top. You could argue about others. I talked about some that I thought were vital interests in the context of future possibilities for the terrorism that we might experience. It's not a succinct answer, but that's what I've seen in my experience, is that we are attracted to an array of things, that each one of which are inherently good, but they keep us from focusing on the vital from time to time.
I think I would probably characterize it a little bit differently. whose definition of vital. There are, even within the U.S. government, there's certainly people who would say that oil is primary and others that would say the peace process is, and there's more than one. I would say there are a number of interests, but we also have American values. Or do we care about human rights? Is that going to trump our desire for the prevention of terrorism or getting oil? Do we look askance at some in order to achieve the others? I think it's very easy to say, well, we need one simple answer, and that should drive everything else, but I don't think that the reality is quite that simple. I think we have a number of different interests. I think we want their help on the Middle East. Certainly oil is a question. I think we want stability in the region, and we want terrorism to stop emanating from the region, and some of these things work together and others do not. And so I do think it makes it difficult, and I do think that you then have to look at the individual countries. We have different interests in different places, and I wish it was as simple as that, but I don't know that I think it is. And to the gentleman in the back, just a couple of thoughts. I also disagree with your view that these governments were benign. I don't know if you've read the human rights reports or the religious freedom reports over the years. If you're aware of the ministries of interior and the things that they do, of the lack of freedom for journalists and the average people. So I'm not sure why you're feeling that they are the benign ones. As far as the U.S. driving this, I think if you talk to anybody in any of these countries, they will disagree that the U.S. has a role and certainly refute that. While we certainly have, for a long time, worked with organizations on democratic principles, on how to run a campaign, on how to be in an election, on how to advertise your message, we in no way orchestrated this, and as I said early on, we were as much taken by surprise about this as anybody else was, and as everyone has noted, we're all trying to figure out the way forward. We don't have the answer. So I think if you look at the way that this began and the pace at which it has spread across and the fact that it has been begun by the average people on the street, hopefully you'll see that this is not something being orchestrated by the great power.
I didn't say that.
Terry, you wanted to?
Well, I can be brief because I agree with all the last speakers. I've written down, as the overarching thing, a stable Middle East. That's a very easy thing to say. But that serves the purposes of the economic purposes, the maintaining the stability in oil production, for example, and of that, in that area, Saudi Arabia is without doubt the most important country in terms of size and so on. Libya's contribution to oil production is very, very small compared with the others. And there are the counter-terrorism issues. And then, I'm saying it rather, I know it's part of, it's not just in the United States, by the way, the UK and other European powers feel the same way on the humanitarian issues. And in this case, not another Srebrenica was very much in people's minds. Not another Rwanda. And so that became a driving force. I'm not helping in answering your question, but I think democratic countries, whether it's the United States or any other power that's directly affected by events in the Middle East. And so I'm circling back probably to Harold Macmillan. Events, my dear boy, it's events. And I think a stable Middle East is what we're looking for. And why do we, the United States, have a long relationship with Mubarak? It's for exactly that reason. We need his help in the Middle East peace process and so on. But that, over time, because of the way inside those countries, with advances in information technology and the way that people can connect with other parts of the world, it became no longer sustainable. So I don't think the United States or anyone else had a choice about supporting or not supporting Mubarak. I think the events drove us to the particular policies that we've now come to. I think we can argue about what we're doing in Libya. Is that a threat to U.S. strategic interests? I think we have an interesting discussion about that, and that's why the humanitarian issues come to the top, because there was not another Srebrenica issue. So I think stable Middle East, the economy, particularly obviously energy supply, is hugely important. I think the counter-terrorism issue, if you think of the wider Middle East from Morocco through to Pakistan, that's the other issue that should drive our policies in the region. Thank you.
Yes, Steve, please.
I'll just be brief. We have a multiplicity of interests, and the problem is that some of them contradict with, are in contradiction with one another. We want to keep the flow of oil, yes. We want to protect the peace process, yes. We want to promote democracy, but that means in many cases that it will be unstable. So, you know, this is the basic dilemma that every policymaker faces. We want, for instance, to have democratic elections in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt, but we don't want the Muslim Brotherhood to win those elections. But you can't have it both ways, because if there are free elections, they just might vote for the guy that you don't want. So that's the essence, you know, the stable Middle East. Yes, we want the stable Middle East, but at what price? At the price of supporting repressive regimes? That is the dilemma.
Thank you, Stephen. Just when you spoke, it reminded me another famous quote by George Washington about capabilities, when he said that we must consult our means rather than our wishes, and specifically saying not to attempt to think about success that may make matters worse. So it's the intentions and the capabilities. Now let me move on to two people, and would you kindly identify yourself and ask a question?
Yes, my name is Ali Liami from the Center for Democracy and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia. It's here in Washington, D.C., not in Riyadh. I would agree with the last speaker. You said 2 points, and that is extremely important. Arabs are now focusing on their internal problems instead of blaming us and the Zionists and everybody else. I'm a father of a Iraq war veteran. Also, the other important point you mentioned is that you alluded to it. The Arabs have decided to take charge of their lives, whether we like it or not. I also agree with Margaret Nardi that our values are extremely important, and if we lose those values, which make America the envy of the world, then it doesn't make any difference what policies we have. We will end up failing. The problem with our policy in general in the Middle East, we made oil the only thing we are after, without paying attention to about 300 million people. Now that they decide to take charge of their lives. General Stalder, is it? You said, I'm from Saudi Arabia, the elephant in the room. Actually, we are organizing a conference in collaboration with the Heritage Foundations, the 28th of this month, and the title of it is the Saudi Monarchy, the elephant in the room. So you should all come and listen to what people have to say. You said we should help the Saudis to avoid the fate of Mubarak and others. How could we help the last absolute monarchy in this planet to accept the fact that the country and the people of that country is not their private property?
Well, I mean, that's clearly no small task. But the writing is on the wall, so to speak, in a way that it has never been on the wall, and it cannot fail to escape the Saudi royal family and the leadership of that country, that they're next if they don't do something soon and something dramatic and something fundamental in terms of reforms, or they will surely, and that's a bold statement.
Tell Margaret, how do we help them?
Well, I think it begins with frank dialogues and offers of assistance. They surely understand what's at stake here. I'm not in the State Department, but that's where I would start.
I think it's a very good question, a very hard question, and I certainly don't have the answer. Obviously, they're very aware of what's going on, and they sent troops into Bahrain to make sure that things don't go awry there. How they handle it remains to be seen. The same is true in Algeria, watching Libya, and others in the region that fear they may be next. So all of them are trying to decide what they're willing to give up in order to stay in power, and they're all choosing, I think this was discussed earlier, choosing different paths. And I think it's the events in the region that will drive what they do more than any U.S. pressure, but obviously we certainly are engaged in a dialogue.
Dr. Hamid, maybe the last one come up here. I know you can make a big speech.
I'll try to make it short as possible. Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion, truly. And my question is about Libya, because I noticed the intervention in Libya was sort of a partial intervention. It was not a complete one. So it's like, for me, I'm basically a medical doctor, giving half dose of antibiotics. It does not kill the organism, it just allows resistant strains to be developed. So the US intervention in Libya, if it was really complete, the US would have probably reversed the image that happened in the Afghani war and Iraq war. I have to tell you honestly, this is perceived as if the Islamists defeated the US. This is how it is perceived. So the US had a golden opportunity, if intervened properly, to regain the powerful image of the US. And this is important in the Muslim world that respects the concept of power. But coming back to the main point, do you think that no intervention in Libya was probably, in my view, better than the partial intervention that happened, and it did not end the problem? It will create a Gaddafi, if he survived, that he can have some sort of state-sponsored terrorism, and he can cause a lot of troubles. And also the image of America in the Muslim world as powerful country, I'm talking here militarily, is weakened because simply they couldn't remove al-Gaddafi. So my question is, was it better not to do anything or to intervene fully? And how do you see this partial intervention? I see it negative, and I'd like to see your opinion.
Everyone will have a chance, so we'll start with you, General. No. Okay, Stephen, let's start with you.
Now, from an operational perspective, the U.S. participation and initiation of the no-fly zone was mediocre operationally to the problem at hand. I say that not as a criticism. I expected the conversation in Washington here went something like this. Very incomplete information was available about the situation on the ground in Libya. There was a tremendous desire to avoid another Rwanda or a Bosnia scenario. Quite frankly, there are not ground forces readily available to deploy if that sort of situation is beginning to happen. And the choice was the best of many not so good options, including the option to do nothing at all. It's not clear to me that the second and third order consequences were considered. Of course, I'm not inside those discussions. I know what I see on the news. The initial messaging from the U.S. military and senior leadership in DOD was very garbled, and they hadn't thought their way through this, and it was very obvious to me. But I think the intentions were good. The information extremely limited, no matter what you say about intelligence in the current age. it's very difficult to know something like that. And ultimately, this is a situation requiring ground forces. If you truly want to have the outcome that you desire, you've got to put people on the ground. You can't do it with airplanes. Thank you.
Oh, when you have the last word.
Choose to clean up.
Let me just say that I think you highlighted exactly the dilemma. But if you ask yourself, what would have been the result if we hadn't intervened at all? I think the sentiment in the Arab world would have been, in the Muslim world, would have been very harsh, the judgment. These West just let, all this is hypocrisy about political right. They had a chance. There was this group, and they let them, Muslims get slaughtered by this horrible dictator. So that would have been a price you'd have paid. Having done it, it is clear that it's not working, and that now we are faced with another choice. Do we go beyond the mandate? And I think there are strong arguments for doing it, because I think the consequences, now this is just a personal opinion, the consequences of leaving Gaddafi in power, both politically and militarily, would be far worse than what we're doing now. As I said, if you continue on the course that we are on, there will be a stalemate, most likely a western part of Libya with Gaddafi in power, an eastern part which will have to have a no-fly zone. There'll be all sorts of, it'll be very, very, very messy. I think it was very difficult to predict exactly what would happen with the humanitarian intervention. After all, the first initial phase of this, when the United States was involved and so forth, actually went reasonably well. But now Gaddafi, no fool, he changed his tactics, and essentially now has his forces more or less intervening with the population. That requires close air support, and I agree with the general, of course. Eventually, you might even have to put troops on the ground. But the situation has changed, and that is often the case, as the general knows. What happens in war? What you think is going to happen doesn't always happen. So you've outlined, I think, very clearly the choices that we face now, and it's up to each of us to decide, and obviously in the end the President and his advisors, whether it is now worth doing something else.
Right. Perhaps, Mark, could I make a couple of points? I agree with Stephen Araby's response to this really excellent question, because it does focus the mind. And it brings to my mind this awful question that's often raised in this country, not so much in my own country, exit strategy. I think that's totally the wrong way to think about military operations as a former military officer. And we should be thinking in terms of once you engage in armed force, which results in death and destruction to achieve a positive aim, obviously in the end, you have to plan for success. And if the policy gets in the way of military success, then you will have failure. There's no other way of describing it. There's not a halfway. So you have to plan and implement military action for success. So I think looking at U.S. policy right now, as someone who's free from government can make my own views, I think it's unfortunate that there are wrong messages being sent. I can understand why, about U.S. Having a less prominent role in NATO. That doesn't make sense. They have the Supreme Allied Commander. It just doesn't make sense. As if NATO was some separate entity that, they have to fully belong. We have to stand together. Otherwise, that undermines and sends totally the wrong messages. I can understand why the President's doing this, because of domestic pressures and so on. I fully appreciate that. But it does undermine the whole operation. I think both in a technical sense and a technical military sense, and in a political sense. It's most unfortunate. We spend a lot of time complaining about some NATO allies having an a la carte approach to Afghanistan. There are certain countries who will not take part in military offensive operations. Only the US, UK, maybe Canadians, and I can't remember who else, do the offensive operations. So I think that's a most unfortunate policy development. I really wish that could somehow be corrected. So we have to stop thinking about exit strategies. That's very popular in Congress, and it happens also in the UK Parliament and so on. We all live in democracy, so there has to be a response. But I agree with Stephen. I don't think the President had an option about not to intervene. I think the pressures were just far too great. Srebrenica, Rwanda, we've all said that. So I don't think an option, but having decided to intervene, then you have to plan for success. That's all I would say. Thanks.
I agree with everything that's been said as far as why we went in and why is this different than other countries, which is, of course, the question that's being asked. The rationale for going in this case was Gaddafi was making a number of statements that he would fight till the last drop of blood, that he'd take everybody with him. He made very clear, very publicly a number of times that he would do this, and given his history, we took him at his word. At the same time, the rebel groups specifically asked for our assistance, which we didn't have in the other countries. The Yemenis weren't asking for that, didn't ask for it in Tunisia or Egypt. And so those were the reasons. I think the feeling was everybody who's criticizing us now would have been equally critical if we had just sat by and let everybody be slaughtered. It would have given Gaddafi a win. He would have then lost the faith of the international community and been shut out as he is now. And it is even more likely, I think, that he would return to his old habits of supporting terrorism elsewhere on the continent and in the Middle East. And then we would have lost any leverage that we had to try and make that change. So I don't think we had a choice. I, frankly, personally was frustrated with the amount of time that it took to go in. Now, there are people who say, well, look at the Balkans, this is much faster than that. Well, I think it could have happened faster, and I frankly think that if it had happened a week or so faster, things might have been slightly different. Because the rebels did have the momentum, they had the surprise element, and they lost all of that. Unfortunately, by the time we went in, they were already on the downturn, and so now we are in this situation that's a great frustration for everybody. And I think there is a real risk that, if he doesn't go, we will have a long-term problem, and that's not something that anybody wants. How to affect that change is a real question. Our stated goal was never to take him out. Our hope was that people would be able to do that. And now here we are. So, I mean, frankly, I don't have the answer, but I do believe that we had to go in, and that if we hadn't, we would have paid a different price.
Thank you very much. I'm going to call on General West to make some closing remarks. Just one quick footnote. I really think we shot a lot of ground, and the panelists and the audience contributed a great deal. Obviously, we couldn't cover everything, and this really means we need another seminar, for example, to discuss the Sudan that is being considered to be removed from the list, etc., etc. Meanwhile, this area obviously is being used as a transit for the flow of weapons from Iran through Egypt to Gaza and so on and so forth. But at any rate, one last point. I will be remiss if I wouldn't thank first Laurie Kenny right here, who contributes a great deal to our communication capabilities. She's the Director of Communication of the Atomic Institute, and she makes sure that everybody would see what's happening here. And finally, I want to thank our team of interns who contributed a great deal to our work. I will ask Pat over here from UCLA. Would you introduce our group very quickly?
The interns stand up. It's our intern group in the back.
The bad news is that this group would have to deal with this problem in 20, 30 years. But the good news is they're very capable, and I'm sure they will find some good solution to the challenges facing us. General?
To close it out quickly, the quote was made about the winds of change. Let's hope the winds fill our nation's sail and it moves our ship in the right direction. Strategy and policy, matches and mismatches. We were warned about this by Thucydides in the history of the Peloponnesian Wars. If you don't get those right and aligned, you will suffer the consequences. History has a strange way of teaching us. Last night, walking through the Atlanta airport, there's a lot of uniforms that walk around the Atlanta airport because that's a point where a lot of our soldiers get on planes to go elsewhere. I passed 2 average Americans. You watch a soldier go by, I was about 10 feet behind him, and one Joe said to another Joe, it's not long before they're on the ground in Libya. Interesting to hear that from the common American. The last analogies have been used. I can't help but think about the lady and the tiger. We're looking to open a door. Which one do we open, and do we have enough intelligence to open the right one? I don't mean that intelligence in our head, but the insight on which door to open. And too often, you crack the door and you see the tiger and you want to jam it shut and then reach for the other one for the lady. Sometimes you open both at the same time. Sometimes you open neither. This is tough. 30 years, it's going to be your problem. Are you going to do it any better than we did? There you go. You're laughing. Don't laugh. This stuff's hard. I thank Dr. Alexander and our panel very much, and thank our audience for participating.